unfiltered, uncensored points of view so that we can all make sense of all of this craziness happening before our eyes. They don't always agree on much, but today they thrash it out to see if they can agree on something. We go through the economy, Trump, Elon Musk, EEI, censorship, wokeism, and why so many men are struggling. Why are tens of thousands of millionaires running away from the UK? The terrifying truth and opportunity in AI. And I ask all of them, what is the most important thing in 2025 that nobody is talking about, with the aim of reaching clarity, agreement, and having a laugh in the process? This is the episode you probably didn't know you needed. This has always blown my mind a little bit. 53% of you that listen to this show regularly haven't yet subscribed to this show. So could I ask you for a favor before we start? If you like the show and you like what we do here and you want to support us, the free, simple way that you can do just that is by hitting the subscribe button. And my commitment to you is if you do that, then I'll do everything in my power, me and my team, to make sure that this show is better for you every single week. We'll listen to your feedback, we'll find the guests that you want me to speak to, and we'll continue to do what we do. Thank you so much. You guys are three of the best commentators, the most articulate people I know that also have the most interesting, broad experience and also, I think, political background. So I wanted to talk to you about everything that's going on in the world, and I wanted to ask you guys some of the dumb questions that I ponder alone with myself and with my dumb friends in my WhatsApp group. It feels to me that the world is at a real moment of transition in many regards, so like social transition, cultural transition, economic transition. And I think the US has been a catalyst for all of that. So that's why I wanted to have this conversation today. We've got an American here, Scott. I think Scott's the only American here. We've got Constantine, we've got Daniel, who are two Brits, but spend a lot of time between America as well. And so I want to come to Scott first and ask Scott a question, which is a very big, broad question, which is from your perspective, Scott. You know, when I talk about this feeling of transition, that seems to be like almost inside my chest, that we're at a really historic moment. What is your analysis on this? What is the big picture here? What's happened over the last 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months? And how is that going to impact all of us around the world?
Well, if you think of the U.S. as setting the tone economically and maybe even culturally for the West, there's definitely a reversion away from, people feel that quote-unquote wokeism, and I don't like to use that word, but I'll use it here, was this sort of overcorrection to systemic racism, and that it began to cause more damage than it was, cause more problems than it was solving. And I think there's been a serious kind of lurch back, if you will, whether it's executive actions, declaring the border a state of emergency, and stuff around saying that gender is a thing, there's male and female. And most of these issues the actually American public supports. I would say on a more cynical level, America used to be a platform for prosperity, protection of civil rights, the projection of women's rights and power and democracy abroad. And I would argue that it feels like a pretty quick transition to almost like I call it a kleptocracy, but America's become a platform for acquiring wealth and then leveraging that wealth as a means or a proxy of power. And the ultimate example of that was the launch of two meme coins, the Trump coin and the Melania coin, the day before the presidency, such that this conversation could have already or might happen this week, and I'll finish here. President Trump, it's Vlad. We're thinking about stabilizing our currency or trying to stem the outflows of our reserves. So we're thinking about pulsing in about 600 billion rubles into the Trump coin, which, based on my economist estimation, would take the value of it to a $20 or $30 billion market cap, making you one of the wealthiest men in the world, Mr. Trump, and none of this would be disclosable or transparent. Also, in unrelated news, we'd really appreciate you seizing arms shipments to Ukraine. So I think we've gone kind of full kleptocracy, is the way I would describe it.
Are you optimistic, Scott?
Well, I'm a glass half empty guy. I don't know if I'm just getting older, but no, I don't see a man convicted of sexual abuse or found liable who inspired an insurrection retaking the White House as a point of light for the American experience.
Constantine, I suspect you'd have a slightly different view on all of the above. How are you feeling about everything that happened yesterday? Did you watch the inauguration? What is your big picture, 30,000 feet view?
I think it's incredibly unwise to make bold predictions about what's going to happen over the next 6 to 7 months. I do think what America had at the election and what the election of Donald Trump represents is something that we in the UK don't have, which is choice. They had a very clear choice between two very different perspectives on the world, between two very different approaches, between two very different candidates. And ultimately, criticisms of President Trump are necessary and legitimate, of course they are. But at the end of the day, I believe, having spent quite a lot of time in America around election time and also generally, and traveling around real America, not just in DC and LA and New York, the reason that he was elected was that the American people are not prepared to accept what Europeans have decided they're prepared to accept, which is managed decline. The American people do not want their country to become weaker. They do not want it to become poorer. They do not want to impoverish their fellow citizens through net zero. What they want is their country to be great, their country to be powerful, their country to be influential. The economic realities for most Americans are not really reflected in the figures that we are told. So when people talk about inflation, the reality of people's lives on the ground is that their cost of living has gone up very, very significantly over the last few years. And that's not always reflected directly in the overall inflation figure that we're shown, because certain things are much more influential in people's lives than others. And so whether the decision to elect President Trump ends up being this positive thing for which there should be lots of optimism is a matter of the next 4 years. Are we going to see a presidency that really does everything it promises? And by the way, if you look at the things that Donald Trump is promising, I think whether you're left or right, you have to acknowledge that they are things that are worth doing. Having a secure border so that people don't come into your country illegally is a basic duty of government. Economic prosperity is a basic duty of government. Withdrawing America from a kind of simultaneously aggressive but weak posture around the world, where America sort of says, yeah, we're going to get involved in these foreign conflicts, but we're not actually going to then practically help Ukraine win that war, is a kind of stupid position on both, whichever side you're on. So on all of these things, and of course, Scott mentioned wokeness. I think he's absolutely right that there is a massive backlash happening around the world, because lots and lots of people who were completely apolitical until the last 3 or 4 years, or maybe until 2016, just feel like the world has gone crazy, and suddenly they're supposed to pretend that men can change sex and become women, and now they're entitled to be in female prisons. And if your teenager says that they are the opposite sex, you're supposed to chop their breasts off, and all of this other stuff that ordinary people just look at and go, this is crazy. Like, I am liberal, but this isn't liberal. This is some kind of weird thing that's going on. And I see the backlash against all of that all over the Western world. And I think Donald Trump signifies that people are fed up of that. And I have been warning for a very long time that if the woke left continues to exercise this level of influence on our public debate, the reaction will be the rise of the right. And Donald Trump is one of the most diplomatic and pleasant versions of what you're likely to get if the left keeps going crazy. We will see what challenges the world throws at him over the next 4 years, and whether he is capable of responding to them.
Scott, has the left lost its way, in your view? And if so, how did that happen? And just to respond on some of Konstantin's points about Trump being the best of a sort of right-wing collective, are we going to see right-wing sort of ideology spread throughout the Western world over the coming years? What's your take on all of the above?
Definitely, we Democrats, we get it right, and then we just go too damn far. And so I look at, I'm a professor on a campus. DEI, 60 years ago, there were 12 black people at Princeton, Yale, and Harvard combined. That was a problem. Race-based affirmative action makes sense. This year, more than half of Harvard's freshman class identifies as non-white. But 70% of those non-whites come from dual-income homes in the upper quintile of income earners. The academic gap between black and white used to be double what it was between rich and poor. It's now flipped. So DEI was a good idea that, quite frankly, is not insane and now just represents the same racism it was trying to do away with. So, and then we created two candidates who were the only candidates who could make each other viable. Vice President Harris, given the hand she dealt with, did the best she did. I think President Biden should be buried in a crypt that entitled narcissist who decided that it made sense for him to go back on his pledge to be a transition candidate and gave us a British-style election timing on the Democratic side without in a marketplace where you need time and money. So it was not, we did not have a great candidate. There is an understandable swing back from what is an overcorrection around some of these issues. Parents, we gave them a huge issue with transgender rights. There's more Cadell players in California than transgender rights. Yet the Democrats decided to conflate it with the civil rights movement and think that it was okay for a woman who transitioned, a transgender woman, to enter a bicycle race and finish 5 minutes before everybody else, and then they'll bark up the same tree and decide that it's inspiring. And parents all over the nation are saying, we've literally gone crazy. Where I would disagree a little bit with Constantine is that America choosing economic growth and prosperity. There are 190 sovereign nations and 189 would change places with America over the last 4 years. We hit 71 new record highs in the markets. 97% of all AI. We've created more market capitalization in a 7-mile radius of Espoo International Airport than Europe's created in the last 20 years. We have the lowest inflation in the G7. We have the highest growth. We've grown 10% since 2020. That's triple the rate of Europe. Biden was unable to communicate any of that effectively because there's this psychological dynamic that when your wages go up, you credit your own grit and character. When the price of cereal goes up, you blame the president. Now, similar to the future, or how William Gibson described the future, it's here, it's just not evenly distributed. Prosperity is unprecedented in the U.S. over the last 4 years. It just wasn't evenly distributed. Now, having said that, in America, you can stop working in August and you've produced more and made more money than you have in Europe the whole year. And it has gotten better. It says things are less bad than anywhere in the world in the U.S. Biden was unable to communicate it, and then talking about how great the economy is when rents were skyrocketing, tuition was going up. It was an ineffective strategy. But I don't think it's fair to say Americans chose prosperity. We have prosperity. I would argue that, quite frankly, some of the Republican ideals around deficit spending, which are nothing but taxes on future generations pulled forward. I mean, we'll see how that works. But his signature policies, a clampdown on immigration, tariffs, these things are wildly inflationary. So Constantine's right. It's going to be difficult. You don't know what's going to happen. But it feels to me, I would argue that my favorite appointment in the Trump administration in the adult in the room is the 10-year bond, which is going to say, sorry, girlfriend, when I believe the president tries to implement some of these economic policies.
Constantine, is that true? Because what I heard there is that effectively Trump had a better marketing campaign, and that reality is somewhat different from what the Americans were sold in the last election cycle.
Well, politics is about marketing, and Trump is the marketer in chief. He's very good at branding and selling ideas, and partly that's what politics is about. But in terms of the economy, I think Scott is entirely right. It's one of the reasons I admire America so much, the sense of dynamism and economic growth and the desire to create things and build things. It's an observation I've had every time I've been there. If you have a successful restaurant in the UK, you go, well, I've got a successful restaurant. In America, if you have a successful restaurant, you open a second one and a third one, and you create a chain. Right? So their attitude to business more broadly is fantastic, and I love it. But I think the difference is that I don't think Americans were comparing the American economy under Joe Biden to the European economies. They were comparing the American economy under Joe Biden to the American economy under Donald Trump in his first term, and also what they expect him to do for the future. When they look at the fact that he's got real business leaders in government now, like Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, talking about government efficiency. We have to admit that all Western countries have a massively bloated civil service, what we call civil service in the UK, and the administrative state in the US, that wastes a huge amount of money, that produces very little in terms of output in many cases, and that needs to be slimmed down, and people, I think, are very excited about that. And when I talk to business leaders in America, including ones that were never on the Trump train, so to speak, so many of them went over to his side in this election cycle because they just felt that he was going to continue to accelerate American growth and continue to deliver prosperity for the American people. Now, Scott's point about tariffs and all of these other things, I've listened to Donald Trump enough now to know that you should not necessarily be taking him literally. I think many of the things he says are negotiation tactics and signaling. So when he says, I'm going to build this or do that or do this, you have to sort of read between the lines. When he says, this will be the worst thing, that you just go, he's saying to people like, you better work with me, otherwise this is going to work out badly for you, on all of these things. And so it remains to be seen whether he's successful in those tactics of getting what he wants. Look, America is always going to be an unequal society. It's designed in a way that is going to make it that way. In America, the focus is how do we grow the pie? In Europe, the focus is how do we divide it up so everyone gets their fair little share, right? So Americans are about expanding the pie, and then the people who bake the pie get as much of it as they possibly can. But the question is, can there be a sense in America that the American dream is alive? That you do not have to work 3 gig economy jobs to pay your rent, that you're going to be able to buy a house, that you're going to be able to afford to have children, that you're going to be able to raise a family perhaps on a single income, something that most people only dream about nowadays. That's really what this whole economic conversation is about. And we will see over the next 4 years if Donald Trump is able to slightly even change the direction of travel towards those things that actually Americans of my generation and older used to take for granted as the promise of the country that they live in.
I've thought a lot about this over the last couple of weeks in particular, because we're hearing these big headlines in national papers in the UK that millionaires are leaving the UK in historic numbers. I think it's 10,800 millionaires left last year, which is an increase of about 160% versus the previous year. And the general sentiment in terms of business confidence in the UK is at a several-year low. So I think it's the lowest it's been since just post-pandemic. There's this, I think it's the Institute of Accountants. They call up 1,000 accountants every year, and they run a survey to see how much confidence they have in business in this country. And it's fallen 14 points to 0.2% confidence in terms of business. There's this bigger narrative emerging amongst my entrepreneurial friends that if you want to start a business right now, the best place to be in the world is to be in America, is to get over to America and to leave the UK. Now, Dan, how does that square? I know you have an accelerator, you speak to lots of entrepreneurs. How does that sort of compare or contrast with what you're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, 100%. The value proposition for the UK has dropped through the floor. Very, very high tax. The ecosystem of business is in decline. Some of the smartest people are now in Dubai. Some incredible creators that I know have moved to Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai. Many are going to the USA. So if people are interested in bigger markets and bigger opportunities, they're into the USA. If they're interested in lower tax and more fringe opportunities, they're in the Middle East. And essentially, the UK hasn't found a place in the world. I think there are 3 business models the UK could go for, which is either the head office of Europe, which is what we were when we were inside the EU, and everyone used to come here to build a European business. We could be the back office of the USA, so the incubator for the USA. A lot of smart companies get to their first 50 million of value here in the UK and then sell to a US private equity firm or a US listed company. And a lot of US companies are now actually coming here to poach talent or to outsource things to the UK more cheaply than they could do it in the US. The wages in the UK are through the floor compared to what you would pay in the US, especially tech roles. So very smart people in the UK are massively evading. And then the third option would be to be an independent tax haven and to go with the low crime, low tax model of Dubai, Singapore, those kind of options. So we haven't really picked one of those three yet. We're still, all these years after Brexit, and we haven't said which of those three models we want to adopt.
Scott, you moved here a couple of years ago to the UK, and despite everything that's going on in the UK, are you still bullish on this being a place for entrepreneurship and business? I was looking at some stats before we started this conversation around the sort of key areas of concern for me. Business stats I've talked about there, the drop in business confidence, the entrepreneur exodus that we're seeing, the things like knife crime in the UK are up 81% over the last decade, which I think is a symptom probably of something else. And one of the big things I think a lot about as an entrepreneur at the moment is artificial intelligence. And our investment in artificial intelligence from a global perspective is down about 2,000% versus a country like America. So you've moved here, you've brought your family here. Are you bullish on the UK versus the US from an entrepreneur's perspective?
So the question I get most frequently when I speak here is to compare and contrast the US with the UK, and I use a personal anecdote. My parents immigrated to the US from Glasgow and London when they were to enormous risk. I've been an entrepreneur my whole life. Like, a lot of my success isn't my fault, but I inherited some of that risk-taking DNA. When I speak to people in the UK, I say the primary difference is you're the ones that stay. And that is, it kind of comes down to a risk appetite. The US has 5 times per capita the number of entrepreneurs. It has 5 times the dollar volume per startup. There's $5 million in venture capital waiting to be deployed for every startup in the US versus 1 million in Europe. I love what Constantine said about a restaurant. I went into this great little restaurant in Soho a few weeks ago called Dig In, and I loved it so much. I left my card and said, "Can you have the owner? I'd like to fund I'd like to open another one. Does he need money?" I just would never do that here. I thought that was a really interesting insight. And the collision of risk, crazy ideas that occasionally become crazy genius, and technology and intellectual property and great universities results in a company that no one had heard of 5 years ago being worth more than the entire UK stock market, NVIDIA. So there's just an enormous difference. The way I would summarize my impression of the UK economy, I'll just say London. I have no experience in that. I don't go anywhere that's not walking distance from Marylebone, so my bubble is pretty opaque. But the way I would describe the economy here is, I love the term the butler economy, and that is all the money I see being made here is people servicing wealth created somewhere else. You're either in financial services servicing rich people, you're either opening a restaurant or hospitality servicing rich people, but I don't see a lot of organic wealth creation. I interviewed the 2 quote-unquote inventors of AI at one of your prestigious universities. My first question is, how the hell were you not able to make any money if you invented AI? Why haven't you been able to capture any money? Just for your listeners, my summation of Europe versus the US after molesting the earth for the last 35 years is US is still the best place to make money and Europe is still the best place to spend it.
Is this a failing nation, Scott?
I think you have too much going for you to be described as a failing nation. You still have amazing universities. London's still the second best city in the world. Premier League, it's an unbelievable export. I know how ridiculous that sounds. People want to be here. There's still rule of law, rule of play. You still produce amazing rock and roll. I just don't see how you could say this is a failed. I would argue that the second only to our entry into Iraq, the greatest self-inflicted wound was Brexit. An American can't understand why you would decide to increase your prices while reducing productivity in one fell swoop. It's difficult for us to wrap our heads around some of the economic decisions the UK has made, but I think a lot of people are kind of betting or hoping that the UK begins to grow again. So I'm in a weird way, I would call myself cautiously optimistic about the UK. I think at some point it begins to occupy the place it should command, if you will.
Constantine, I would ask the same question to you as well. Do you think the UK is a failing nation? And Scott describes self-inflicted wounds there. I've heard you speak of self-inflicted wounds when you talk more broadly about the West and what the West needs to do to turn itself around. And also, just layering a third point on top of that, which is somewhat linked to this, is Elon Musk has taken a particular interest in the UK over the last month in particular, and he's started to describe it online, it seems, as a failing nation. What's your view?
Well, I'm glad you asked me about Elon Musk, because the thing that I love most about the media having this massive meltdown about, oh no, these Americans are interfering in our political... These are the same media commentators who are constantly banging on about American politics and saying, Donald Trump needs to do this, you need to vote for this. Like, all of this stuff is ridiculous. The reality is, we download our culture, our politics, our music, almost everything from America, right? America has become what Britain used to be, which is the center of Western civilization. And my request and ask and begging of British people is, if we're going to download American culture and politics, let's at least take the good stuff instead of all this terrible woke shit that we downloaded from them, the DEI and all this other nonsense, and actually take the entrepreneurial spirit and all these other things that are really great about America. The optimism, the positivity, the willingness to have a go, to take a risk, as Scott was talking about. So I wish we took more of that, and it speaks to your question about, are we a failing nation? Look, I think it's a deliberately inflammatory question, which I don't want to kind of actually accept in that way. But what I think we should acknowledge is, are we trending up or are we trending down? And when you talk about over 10,000 millionaires have left, I hear that through a normal British person's ear. And I worry that there's quite a lot of British people who will hear that and say, oh, good, all of these rich parasites have left. Because that's our attitude in the UK to a very large extent. We see wealthy people not as what they are, which is for the most part, not everybody, but for the most part, people who've created a tremendous amount of value for their fellow human beings, and as a result of that have been rewarded. We see them because we have this history of the landed gentry, and so to us, a millionaire is someone who has these ill-gotten gains that they don't deserve, right? That is not really the world we live in. When I talk to wealthy people in this country and pretty much everywhere else, for the most part, especially in the Western world, these are people who've created something that has fundamentally helped other human beings do something better, do something easier, buy products cheaper, whatever it is. That's who the successful people really are. And we just need an attitude shift. That's what we should be downloading from America. What we should be saying inside our heads is, this person is successful because they've helped other people. Great. How do we get more of those people into our country? And I'm afraid I'm telling you something that you know better than anyone, Stephen. If you don't have entrepreneurs in your country creating businesses and creating jobs, the economy is going to stagnate for the rest of eternity. We have to get smart, talented, driven people into our country instead of chasing them out.
Dan, I know this is a subject that you're very passionate about, and Constantine's articulated it really, really well. I've seen lots of your posts about this subject, Dan. What are you seeing? And is it true that the British attitude is a form of self-harm that's holding us back from our potential?
There are definitely attitudinal factors, but you'll also get the most incredibly entrepreneurial people here in London. London is a melting pot for creativity. You've got, sitting in one city, you've got people who are phenomenal at media, finance, technology, entertainment, politics, defense, like all of this. Like, if you take the best of LA and Washington and New York and Miami and kind of start moving it into one city, you get elements of that in London. It's a very diverse city from that point of view, and it creates an entrepreneurial melting pot. The issue is taxes. Nobody wants to pay 60% of their income in taxes. And as soon as you hit, in the US, you don't hit the top tax rate until you are 6 times the average wage. Here in the UK, it's 2.5 times. So as soon as you're 2.5 times the average wage, you're in real trouble. There are so many people in the UK who deliberately hold their income at £50,000 because after £50,000, you get taxed 40% of your income. So people just give up and they say, I'm not going. I know some really smart, really talented people who could be earning a lot more, and they refuse to pay the 40% rate. So they like keep everything small because they don't want to go from 20 to 40% at the 50 grand rate, which is crazy. And I've employed people who have said, can I have a day off a week rather than going over that threshold? That's a huge issue, the tax issue. The company rate tax is high. The corporate capital gains rate is taxed very high. The VAT is high. The council tax is high. All of these additional taxes just keep piling up. And then the other cost at the moment, if we want to have an AI economy, we need cheap electricity. One thing that Trump has committed to is really, really cheap energy. There is no such thing as a fast growth, high octane economy that has expensive energy. Cheap energy equals fast growth. And we have the most expensive energy in the world. We can't run data centers here because the energy cost is going to be too high. So if we want to have an AI-driven economy, we can't do it with windmills and solar panels that have got frost all over them.
Scott, you look like a lot of thoughts are going through your head following those two comments. What are you thinking?
Well, with respect to energy, Trump issued an executive order calling it an energy crisis. Gasoline in the U.S. on an inflation-adjusted basis is less expensive than it was 50 years ago. We are now the largest oil producer in the world. I would argue that we have a housing crisis, and that the executive order should have been around that. Just going back to the U.S., and I'm curious if the same dynamics, and whether Constantine and Daniel agree with this. I believe the election in the U.S. was supposed to be a referendum on women's rights. Women's rights did not show up. This was a referendum on young men, in my opinion. And that is, if you look at the two cohorts that swung most from blue to red versus 2020, two of the three cohorts, other than Latinos, was people under the age of 30 who in the US are 24% less wealthy than they were 40 years ago. People over the age of 70 or 72% wealthier. Our tax code is basically an attempt to shove money from the young to the old. And two, 45 to 64-year-old women, who I would affectionately describe as their mother. And that is, when your son's in the basement vaping and playing video games, and I think a lot about struggling young men, you don't give a flying fuck about territorial sovereignty in the Ukraine, or transgender rights. All you know is your kid isn't doing well. And 210 times a day, your kid's getting a notification that somebody he knows is on a Gulf Stream or partying in St. Bart's, and it's not him or her. And so we not only have young people not doing as well, this pornographic wealth is just shoved in their face. And you end up with, in my opinion, kind of a young, struggling young man. No group has fallen further faster in the world, I would argue, than young men in America. They are, if you go into a morgue in the United States, and there's 5 people who've died by suicide, 4 of them are men. 1 in 3 men under the age of 30 has a girlfriend. 2 in 3 women under the age of 30 has a boyfriend. Why? You think that's mathematically impossible? Because women are dating older because they want more economically and emotionally viable men. There's 1 in 5 men live at home at the age of 30. 1 in 3 under the age of 25. They're not having sex. They're more obese. They're more depressed. When women don't have a relationship, they oftentimes channel that energy into their professional lives. More women, single women own homes in the U.S. than single men. Women in urban areas under the age of 30 are making more money than men. When men don't have the guardrails of a relationship or a job or being in school, they pour that energy sometimes into unproductive things, misogyny, nationalism or extreme nationalism, conspiracy theories. In some, they become really shitty citizens. They become sequestered from society. So I'm worried in the U.S. our biggest threat is a new species of asexual, asocial young men who are incredibly dangerous, have opted out of America. 60% of 30-year-olds used to have 1 child in America, and that's 27%. So people, I think in the U.S., and this is a genuine question, I don't know if it's the same problem here, our tax policies have taken money from the young, stuffed them in the pockets of old people, so Nana and Pop-Pop can upgrade from Carnival to Crystal Cruises. Meanwhile, young people can't afford education, they can't afford housing. And we especially see this really acute emerging crisis among young men who are just opting out of America, who don't even want to try and date, don't even want to enroll in school, don't want to even try and get a job, just stick in their basements and go on Reddit or Discord, or why go try and shower or work out and get a relationship when you have YouPorn? Why get a job when you can trade stocks or crypto on Coinbase or Robinhood? I think this is, in my opinion, this is the most dangerous trend in America right now.
It was almost like demonizing men for decades has consequences. I mean, this is what's been happening. Men are the root of all evil, the root of all evil, the root of all evil. Every advert is about, you know, the woman is strong and capable, the guy's pathetic. In every movie, the woman's kicking ass and the man is pathetic. This has been going on for decades. It's a cultural thing as well as an economic thing. And many of us have been saying that when you take meaning and opportunity away from men, if you create an education system that punishes boys for being boys, if you create a society in which traditional masculine virtues become vices, then you will create exactly the sort of thing that Scott is talking about. It's a terrible thing that's been done. Having said that, my message is always the same to young men who I hope are listening, which is the answer to your problems is never going to be, as Scott says, porn and this and that. The answer to your problems is going to take responsibility, go out and get a job or create a business and actually make your life better. No one's coming to save you. No one's coming to help you. There is no, the sort of programs that we have for women where we sort of go, well, you know, let's give them an opportunity here. None of that's happening for men. It's not going to happen because for evolutionary reasons, we just don't feel sorry for men the way that we do for women. That's the reality. I know it sucks. But the answer for men is going to be the answer that's always been the answer for men, which is for you to get off the sofa, to get off the couch and go out and actually do and create and build and find your own way through it, even if you have to acknowledge that the society you live in has been conditioned for quite a long time to think that you're a piece of shit because you happen to have the genitalia that you do. Now, that I think is the harsh reality of it. And I think Scott is right to point this out as a problem. And I hope that we start to have, both in terms of economic policy, but in terms of also just the cultural conversations and the way we talk about these issues, we come back to something that human beings have known through the entire history of our species, which is men and women are both good and need to work together in order to thrive and succeed together, in order to have families, in order to have children, and in order for us to have healthy communities and healthy societies. You need healthy femininity and you need healthy masculinity, and they need to come together and work together. That's what we're supposed to do. And these stupid gender wars and this idea that men as a group are this and women as a group are that, all of that just needs to end.
I was watching last night as Trump sat there signing all of those executive orders, and I also watched his inauguration speak where he said, we will forge a society that is colourblind and merit-based. And he signed a bunch of executive orders last night to eliminate a variety of different DEI programs in the federal government, directing agencies to dismantle these practices within 60 days. And then over the last couple of months, we've seen Meta come out and dismantle and reverse some of their DEI programs. We've seen McDonald's, Walmart, Ford, Harley Davidson, Boeing, Amazon, Toyota. It feels like there's a real shift happening in both how, you know, sort of identity politics, but also in the sort of corporate environment that those identity politics have really emerged from. Are you supportive of Trump's move to roll back DEI measures?
So I think there's a lot of nuance here. I would argue in universities, DEI is used as a giant misdirect from people such as myself who are enforcers of the caste system and wake up every morning and look in the mirror and ask ourselves the same question: how do I increase my compensation while decreasing my accountability? And what I found is the ultimate strategy is to create an LVMH rejectionist bullshit elitist strategy where Dartmouth sits on an endowment of $8 billion and lets in 500 kids. So the conversation around who gets in is a misdirect from the important question that is how many. If you are not growing your endowment or your freshman class faster than population, you should lose your tax-free status. We should be letting in more gay kids, more trans kids, more white Republicans in rural states. You know who doesn't talk about DEI? Junior colleges, because there's no admissions. They don't have a problem with DEI. So I think DEI on campus has ended up eating its own tail, started out with the right idea. Now it's nothing. And I would argue the same is somewhat true of the Democratic Party. I went to the Democratic National Convention. On the dnc.org website, it lists 17 special interest groups, and it says explicitly who we serve. Asian Pacific Islanders, seniors, veterans, Black Americans, the disabled. It basically lists, I added this up, 76% of the population. And when you say you're actively advocating for 76% of the population, you're not advocating for 76% of the population. You're discriminating against the 24%. It's gone too far. I would argue in the workplace, having served on 7 public company boards, and I'm going to do a lot of boasting here because I'm desperate for all of your affirmation, and 12 private company boards. There's still work to be done in the private sector. There still is a cycle. 40% of all venture capitalists and probably 70 or 80% of all venture capital deployed are white guys from just 2 universities, Stanford and Harvard. So I would argue universities, it's gotten out of control. I'd love to see the DEI apparatus disassembled, along with the ethics department, the sustainability department, the leadership department. These are all bullshit where we hire formally important people with no standards and never get fired. It just translates to more student debt. In the boardroom, in corporations, in certain sectors, I do think there is the need to be thoughtful about broadening the aperture of the lens and bringing in people who are underrepresented. There's still a dearth of women raising venture cap. So I think it's nuanced based on sector. But to just say all DEI is bad, I want to move to what the University of California did in 1997. They don't have race-based affirmative action. They have adversity-based affirmative action. I'm a beneficiary of affirmative action. I had something called Pell Grants. I was raised by a single immigrant mother who lived and died as secretary, so I got grants. I had unfair advantage because I came from a household that was low income. And I think that there should be affirmative action, and I think it should be based on color, but that color is green. The poor need our help. The moment you start advocating for special advantage based on any external factors, I think at this point in our society, it probably causes more problems than it solves.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right, Stephen. And I think if we take a step back and look at why DEI has become such a big part of the conversation, it's precisely because instead of addressing the reality of people's lives, which is some people are disadvantaged and some people are advantaged, actually what we've mainly done, and Scott alluded to at the very beginning of our discussion, is we've given a leg up to very wealthy ethnic minority people from successful families, and their children now get into prestigious universities, which they probably would have done anyway, some of them, because they come from very advantaged backgrounds, and the kids that are growing up in poverty, black and white, have no shot whatsoever. But the reason that it's become such a big issue around the Western world, actually, I don't think it's the nuances that we've delved into here, but actually something else, which is we have created the most ethnically diverse societies in history. And what I mean by that is not that we've created societies in which there are large groups of people who are different from each other, but for the first time, probably in human history, we've created societies in which there is a lot of ethnic diversity, and there is no overt discrimination against some groups of people in the sense of, the imperial societies in the past would have had one dominant ethnic group, which is, the Russians in the Soviet Union, or the Turks in the Ottoman Empire, or the Brits in the British Empire, whatever. That was the ethnic group that was like the dominant one, and everybody else was a kind of second-class citizen, and everybody knew it, right? We don't have that anymore. We have highly diverse societies where people of every single background exist, in which we have this idea that we're all supposed to be equal. And when we have programs that explicitly discriminate against people, there were times when the discrimination was explicit against black people. Well, we've gone full circle now, where the discrimination was going the other way in university admissions, in hiring, in corporate America, in government, in all sorts of things. In this country, the BBC has internships that aren't available to white people, etc. When you get to that point, as Scott said earlier on, everyone just goes, look, I know I'm not supposed to say this, but the reality is this is racism. This is a form of racism, and I thought we were trying to get away from the racism. So to the extent that the elimination of DEI is about creating a merit-based society in which people are given an opportunity because they're skilled and talented and they have the potential to actually achieve things and create wealth. We all know this. We all employ people, right? How many of us are thinking about the races of the people we hire? I don't think we think about that at all. What we're thinking about is, I run a business, I need the very best possible person for this job at the price I'm willing to pay. I don't care if they are purple, green, blue, white, whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters is, are we getting the best person for the job? And my concern about identity politics has always been that if we do not adopt that worldview, then what we will do is create a worldview in which we have different racial groups competing with each other on the basis of race. And that is a very, very dangerous mix for a multi-ethnic society like ours, which is why I've been begging people to let go of this stupid idea of identity politics and to say, first and foremost, we are all Brits, or we are all Americans. We have this umbrella identity under which we all operate, and our personal ethnicity or sex or whatever is secondary to that, and actually for the purposes of employment, for the purposes of college admission, etc., is irrelevant. Yes, if there is disadvantage, if we grew up in a single-parent home with a low income, we may need some extra support there. If we had terrible schooling or our education was not good, we may need extra support. If there's certain things that make it easier for us because of the disadvantages we've had to fulfill our talent potential, I am all for that. But what we've created so far, and that's why I'm delighted it's being eliminated, is an anti-meritocratic system which says, we don't care what you bring to the workplace. We don't care whether you deserve this place or not. We don't care about the potential you have. Actually, we just needed a insert category tick box to fill this slot. And you filled it. It doesn't really matter that you're not doing your job very well, because now we can say, you know, we're a diverse company. I don't care about that, and we shouldn't care about that as a society, and thank God that's now gone.
Yeah, I think the worst part about it too is that it calls into question when someone does succeed, and they're from a diverse background, you know, it calls into question why they got that job in the first place, which I think is horrible. You know, I just hired from two candidates, the final two candidates, was a guy and a woman. I would hate if the woman felt that she got the job because she's a woman and not because she's best. Turns out she was by far the best in the process, and I would love for her to know that there was absolutely nothing that changed our view. We weren't trying to fill a position with a woman, we were trying to fill the position with the best, and she should know she was the best. I think the contrast that was really fascinating was between Trump's website and the Democrats' website. So in the Democrats' website, it was who we're for, which was what Scott was saying. But the Trump's website was the 20 things we're going to do, and it was just a list of 20. These are the 20 action points. This is what we're going to do. This we're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. So it was a to-do list as opposed to the identities that we want to advantage list. And I think that was the choice. You know, at the beginning, Konstantin, you said, you know, America had a choice. And for me, when I looked at those two websites, I saw this choice between the identities being the main thing or the to-do list being the main thing. And it's very different approaches.
Scott, when I was listening to that Zuckerberg interview talking about masculinity and identity issues, one of the lines he said in there sounded like something you've said on my show before, where he said, I think having a culture that celebrates that aggression a little bit more, talking about masculinity, has its own merits that are really positive. Now, Mark Zuckerberg isn't necessarily someone that I saw closely aligning to your worldview. Am I right in thinking that that's something you agree with? Because I remember you saying to me, you think people should be able to walk in a room and kick everyone's ass.
What I've said on your show is that I think the male form, especially under the age of 30, with its bone structure, incredible double twitch muscle, and then this amazing chemical called testosterone, you're going to look back at your 25-year-old self and think, why wasn't I a fucking monster like Steve Harvey? Because, and also, there is, some masculinity when Russian soldiers pour over the border in Ukraine. You want some of that big dick energy that Daniel was talking about. In the case of Zuckerberg, I don't think he really understands an aspirational view of masculinity. I think when he couches immediately kind of trying to kiss Trump's ass because Trump threatened to put him in prison, and what he used to call moderation, he's now calling censorship. And when you have an algorithm that elevates incendiary, hateful content, I would not describe that as masculinity. For me, masculinity comes down to protection, providing, and procreation. And I don't think I think to talk about gendering a workplace in the context of trying to excuse a total elimination of what I would think is probably healthy moderation. I imagine Daniel and Constantine might have a different view. I think he's just couching his supplicant, obsequious, kiss-ass behavior under the auspices of masculinity. It just doesn't ring true for me. And I'm not sure we need to man up or fem up organizations and companies right now. When I talk about masculinity, if I say at a conference, oh, women are better managers, everyone goes, yes, that's right? That's okay. If I say men are more risk aggressive and make better entrepreneurs, you're a misogynist, you're out. And the reality is men and women bring different attributes. But the masculinity and femininity, I think masculinity is a wonderful thing. I think we need a different image of it. I think people born as male have an easier time leaning into those things. Having said that, I work out at CrossFit with a bunch of lesbian firefighters. They bring great masculine energy, and they could carry my ass out of a fire. So a lot of men demonstrate wonderful feminine qualities. A lot of women demonstrate wonderful masculine qualities. I don't think these things are sequestered to anyone born as a specific gender. What I talk about masculinity, I don't talk about it in the corporations. I think that's just fraught with risk and not worth talking about. It should be about shareholder value or stakeholder value. I think young men need a code. We're going to church less. We have fewer relationships. So what's the code you hold onto in terms of creating behaviors that are productive for you, yourself, society? And I think masculinity needs to be redefined as something more aspirational, where you're celebrated for being really fucking strong. You're celebrated for not complaining. You're celebrated for creating surplus value. You create more tax revenue than you absorb. You're celebrated for being aggressive. You're celebrated for breaking up fights at bars, not starting them. You're celebrated for protecting your country, not shitposting it. You're celebrated for approaching strange women and expressing romantic interest. That's not a crime. And if she's not interested and you're rejected, you're both going to be fine. You're celebrated for getting out of the house. You're celebrated for working. You're celebrated for making money and liking money. I think there just needs to be a redefinition of masculinity in the context of helping young men find a code that they used to get from the armed services or from dual parent households. And I feel like they're struggling. So I like the idea of something that they feel in their bones and in their body and in their DNA that they can lean into, that we celebrate. And the conversation is flipped entirely. 5 years ago, I was called misogynist for talking about masculinity. Now the conversation is being led and advocated by one group, and it's mothers who are like, my son is not doing well. I got 3 kids, 2 daughters in PR with the other one's at Penn, and my son is in the basement vaping and playing video games. He needs something to latch on to. He needs a code. Anyways, but I apologize. Word salad. Zuckerberg and masculinity? Give me a fucking break. He looks like a Chechen Molly dealer. Sorry, back to you, Stephen.
Well, it's interesting when you speak, Scott, because your views on masculinity appear to me to be better represented by the right side of politics than the left side of politics. They both have their own vision of masculinity, and yours seems to be a Republican view of masculinity.
To Trump's credit, he saw the opportunity and he flew right into the manosphere. Rockets, crypto, Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn. He said, "No, I'm not going to run from this. I'm going to fly right into it." Now, I would argue that his vision of masculinity has too much coarseness, too much cruelty, too much bullying. I don't think that's masculine. I think when we talk about Elon Musk taking risks, sending rockets that are captured by scissors coming down, inspiring the EV race, taking an enormous risk, making a shit ton of money, yeah, that's a great form of masculinity. Accusing men trying to save Thai soccer players, calling them pedophiles, calling your employees a sex criminal such that they have to leave their house, having 13 kids by 5 women or 3 women, none of which you live with, sleeping next to a loaded gun, losing control of your self-control because of addiction. I don't think that's a great role model. I think he's an amazing role model for boys. I don't think he's a great role model for men.
In terms of energy, there are so many reasons why I'm a big matcha fan, if you don't already know by now. And so much so that I actually invested in the UK's leading matcha company called Perfect Ted. And one of my favorite Perfect Ted products is these delicious matcha pouches that come in every flavor, from salted caramel to peach flavor to mint flavor to berry flavor. One of my favorites is this vanilla flavor, which I'm gonna make in just 2 seconds. You just take this mixer here, get a little bit of a powder, pop it on top of the shaker like that, put the lid on, shake, shake, shake. Delicious. If you haven't tried this yet, you can find Perfect Ted at Tesco and Holland Barrett stores or online, where you can get 40% off with my code Diary40. Head to perfectted.com and put in code Diary40 to try this delicious multi-flavored matcha now. Highly recommend. And if you do it, please tag me, send me a message online. Do you know that 80% of New Year's resolutions fail by February? It's because we focus too much on the end goal, and we forget the small daily actions that actually move us forward. Those actions that are easy to do are also easy not to do in life. It's easy to save $1, so it's also easy not to. Making one small improvement each day, one tiny step in the right direction, has a big difference over time. And that is the 1% mindset, which is why we created the 1% Diary, a 90-day journal designed to help you stay consistent and focus on the small wins and make real progress over time. It also gives you access to the 1% community, a space where you can stay accountable, motivated, inspired, along with many others on the same journey. We launched the 1% Diary in November and it sold out. So now we're doing a second drop. Head to thediary.com to grab yours before it sells out again. I'll put the link below. Elon Musk, censorship. The word censorship was used there by Scott. We've seen this reversal in Meta's attitude, Facebook's attitude that had been built up over a decade, where it almost felt like if you had sort of right-leaning views, or really any unaccepted views, and you posted those on Facebook, you would face maybe having the post deleted or your account suspended. This new world of speech, of free speech, and as it pertains to masculinity, do you think Elon Musk's decision to buy X, which I noticed, Scott, you'd left X, you no longer post or tweet on X anymore, do you think Elon's decision to buy X is a net positive for society?
Net, yes, but I think what people hear when you say that is there's no problems with this system than, compared to the ones we had before. There are definitely disadvantages to a free platform like X now, and one of them is inevitably when you remove censorship, one of the things the censorship was doing was keeping all the deeply unpleasant people away from being able to shove things in your face, and that happens quite a lot on it. So I don't enjoy that aspect of it, but I've always said that would be the price paid for freedom. Freedom always has a price, and that's what we're seeing. As for Zuckerberg, his miraculous transformation into a free speech warrior is just wonderful, and I'm delighted to welcome him. I'm sure it's entirely genuine and not anything to do with the election results we've just seen in any way whatsoever, and the fact that the culture shifted. And those of us who were being censored by people like him for years actually winning the argument. Well, what it shows you is we've won the argument on free speech when it comes to the big tech platforms. And it's going to be messy. And I always said it was going to be messy because inevitably, when you create these large platforms that are algorithmically driven, where the truth and the moderate, reasonable take is not what usually gets attention, you are going to see a lot of unpleasantness. I value the ability to hear and communicate truthful ideas and facts over my own subjective feelings. Oh, someone said a thing I don't like, or someone was racist, or someone was misogynistic. I don't enjoy the fact that that happens, but I would rather that happened and also we were not being censored from saying, COVID probably came from a lab in China, which we were. The Hunter Biden laptop story isn't Russian disinformation. Actually, it's an important piece of information that American voters need to hear when they're making their decision about the election. And all of these other things that were being suppressed and censored across social media for years, they're not anymore. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that's helpful. And if you look at, to bring it back to the UK for a moment, Stephen, as you know, on Trigonometry, we've tried to cover the grooming gangs scandal, and is an outrage what happened in this country over decades. We've been covering that for years, since about 2019, 2020, to very little purchase. And one of the reasons is it was just something that the media sort of covered and then moved on, when it actually should have been something we talked about on a daily basis until serious action was taken and we saw real change in policing, real change in social work, real change in government, real change in the way that these racially aggravated hate crimes were treated. Well, none of that was really being talked about seriously until Elon kicked up a fuss, amplified the voices of survivors, amplified the voices of campaigners on X, which he bought, and now the British government is forced to do whatever it can to actually address those issues to the extent that it will. A lot of people will say it still doesn't go far enough. Well, if it doesn't go far enough, we now have a platform from which we can continue to have that conversation until there is the sort of inquiry and the sort of outcomes that people want.